resolutions shortly in the agenda. So I will just go to the first item on the agenda, which is apologies. Do we have any apologies? No? Cool, thank you. Any items of urgent business? No. On to number 3, any matters of a minor nature for today? Well, this is easy, isn't it? Any conflicts of interest? No. Normally we'd have a chairperson's report, but given this is my first meeting, I have nothing to report at this stage. But we'll look forward to having a chair's report at our next meeting. Tempting to ask the Deputy Chair to give a report on, but I won't. So we'll move straight into item 6.1, which is the Coastal Erosion Environment Canterbury update, which Paul is going to introduce, and I'll ask, just before he does that, get Justin McLaughlin from Environment Canterbury to introduce his team here that are here. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kia ora koutou, everybody. It's good to be here. Thank you for having us today. Very quickly, I'd like to put an apology in for Chair Peter Scott. I'd like to welcome today Councillor Nick Ward, who is just behind me. Sitting next to Nick Ward is Dr. Tim Davey, our Director of Science. We have Helen Jack over the back here, Senior Scientist Natural Hazards, who is going to be speaking today about the tsunami side of life. And obviously myself, Justin McLaughlin, the General Manager here in South Canterbury for Environment Canterbury, and Chris Firth, who can introduce himself very shortly. So if we can just move to the next slide, please. So many of you will be well aware of coastal hazards throughout South Canterbury, but also throughout Environment Canterbury's region. Our purpose today is just really to update you, introduce you to the impacts occurring in our district, and just to highlight the discussions that we've been having with, obviously, your officers from Timaru District Council and other agencies. So giving you, of the 1 to 4 there, a bit of an update, intro at a higher level, an awareness of the public requests, the agency discussions that I just said, and then the long-term issues, and then some planning initiatives that are in play at the moment. I also just want to mention that we do partner with Aorowhenua, and we have had a number of hui with them around coastal hazards. So I'll hand it over to Chris now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. As Justin said, I'm Chris Firth, so I think I know the majority of you. If you don't know me, I'm in the coastal hazards team over at, the natural hazards team over at Environment Canterbury in the Timaru office here. So as Justin said today, it's really just acknowledging this is a new governance group, so some of you may be aware of quite a few of these issues that we're talking, but it's just sort of updating on them and reintroducing or introducing it to sort of new councillors and what's going on our coast, which has been a pretty hot topic for us and for a number of staff probably in your organisation and in other agencies. So without further ado, I'll just crack through. We'll go through some photos and things, and I'll just be able to explain a lot of what's going on as we move. So just starting at the northern end of the district, we obviously have a couple of major hut communities right at the coast, the South Rangatahi and the Milford. They're affected by sort of a range of coastal issues at varying degrees. South Rangatahi huts, it has its issues. It is prone to coastal inundation. There's erosion there, and they have issues with flooding when the mouth becomes blocked because of sea conditions, so flooding from the river. But generally speaking, this one here is sort of somewhat less vulnerable than the Milford huts or in other ones. We have been working with your staff, and we had a one-off clean-up of all that debris you can see in the front of this photo, as that was blocking and impeding drainage out of the huts area when they were getting beach overtopping. So that was a little bit of a success. We've also been working on, they've got a sort of recycling rubbish area at the front there, which we've been laser, but sorry. Along the edge of the beach there is, there's a coastal stop bank, or there's banks to protect from inundation. The sort of usual setup, or what would have been in place kind of 5 years or so ago, is there'd be a natural beach crest a distance away from that bank where that vegetation line starts, and they'll be protecting that bank and the land a lot from flooding. So what we'd be getting is overtopping of that beach crest, sort of dead water in behind, which would then be held in by the bank at the back. But what's happened now is, because of the effects of coastal erosion through time, and especially in the last sort of 3 to 5 years, we've seen a real period of intense erosion, which can happen as sort of a cyclical thing linked to storms. The beach crest is now just pushed all the way and heaped against the land, essentially against where the coastal defences are, and it's just creating a really good ramp for seawater to get in there. So this land's really vulnerable now to overtopping and inundation, saltwater intrusion onto the land and those sorts of things. So if we're heading south between the Opahi and Orari rivers, this is an example of where it has now sort of overwhelmed defences. This photo is taken earlier this year. So you can see the inundation and debris deposition and stuff along the front there. There has been one instance where seawater's gone as far back as that lagoon sort of wetland feature running parallel to the coast, you can see further back. So significant chunks of farmland. The defences along the front there are now more or less wrecked in terms of they've been overwhelmed. They won't hold back much. So what we're seeing in some of these properties now is, even in quite modest swell events or high tide events, we're getting inundation onto the land. So it's a really stressful situation for landowners who are affected. Obviously it has big impacts on their operations and what they're trying to do. The other aspect of it is all these lagoons and things are basically bearing the same impacts. Most of them are freshwater features, but they're having saltwater deposited into them regularly. It's affecting their functionality as a water body, the biodiversity they hold, vegetation, that sort of stuff. So that's a zoom in of that same area. So you can see what's happened to the stop bank there. That bank would have been the same height or similar on the seaward side as it is on the landward side. But you can see there that the beach is now just heaped against it, and there's only probably less than half a metre drop between the top of the bank and the actual beach now. Just a nice, easy ramp for waves to attack that bank and get over the top of it, and that's what's happened here. Waves have overtopped it, scoured it back from the landward side and breached it. The landowners occasionally get in here with machinery and just try and push all the debris and stuff back into the bank, partly to get it off their land, but partly to try and plug holes. But it's essentially ineffective when the sea and everything's set up with like this. So they're scrambling around for options in terms of what they can do to maybe shift defences or for the future of the protection of their land. So moving south further again, this is the Opahi River mouth, the Milford Huts. In terms of a residential population, this is probably the most at risk in the district along the coastal area. Again, really active erosion, up towards 2 metres a year on average in this area is being lost to erosion, which is shrinking that lagoon right out in front of the huts there. And as the lagoon reduces in size, the buffering effect it has in terms of protecting it from the sea is obviously reducing as well. It can now be, it's got so small, that lagoon, it can now be one tide cycle between things looking okay and the lagoon's high enough to be a real threat. So it's putting a lot of pressure on our riverworks staff, who are in turn advising our flood warning staff, and in turn we're talking to the likes of Phil in the back here, the Civil Defence Group over here, and it's putting us in positions where we're having to make decisions about this community really quite regularly. The biggest risk in terms of the coast here is that if the lagoon's full, those big waves coming from a long way offshore, I like this photo because you can see them really rolling in there. If they get over the beach and the lagoon's really full, they can actually continue through without really breaking, and then they'll start breaking on the coastal bank, which is right up hard against the huts, and that puts that bank at real risk of being breached. And should a breach occur, then you're looking at a quite dangerous situation for anybody in that community. So. And that situation is only just going to worsen through time. So it's a real one for the future, is what to do with this community and how to protect it. The other aspect of this area is that it's a really high area of importance culturally and environmentally. There's Mahinga Kai sort of areas in here, but it's quite a highly prioritised environment, I guess we would say, to Arawhenua. And again, the environment's suffering as well. What happens with a lot of these lagoons and things that we can see is not only is the erosion eating them up from the seaside, they're actually getting squeezed on the landward side because of land use practices. They're not being allowed to migrate anywhere or shift, which they might have naturally done had the land not been sort of actively used and behind them. So they're kind of getting squeezed on both sides. And the future, without any change in sort of practice of what we do now, is that they'll just be lost. South of Opuhi, we've seen the stop banks that are kind of overwhelmed. This is kind of tier 2 sitting in behind that, I guess, which is the ones that are now at really high risk of being overwhelmed, but they're still just hanging in there. So landowners in these types of situations are coming to us now and saying we want to shift these defences, we want them moved before we see the same sorts of problems that other people are seeing. How can we do that? What can we do? But it's a really complicated question, in large part because, well, there's a whole host of reasons really, but the lagoons and wetlands in the area make it very complicated in terms of planning rules and framework. Often there's areas of high cultural importance and environmental and sort of biodiversity importance involved, and whatever action is taken with defences can have a positive or negative effect on those environments, so it has to be very carefully considered. And also there's neighbouring effects, so if one landowner takes one action but the neighbours don't, or vice versa, we can end up with sort of perverse outcomes that don't really help anyone. So we have to kind of collectively make decisions in areas of the coast that sort of make sense. It can't just be individuals doing things, so it's a really complex environment in terms of trying to make decisions on what actions we should take. Also bearing in mind that whatever action we make now as immediate response to this sort of threat may well affect the longer term decisions we can make in terms of what do we actually want to do with this coast going forward. So there's a lot of complexity there. You may wonder why I keep mentioning lagoons. We're sort of the environmental organisation, you're the built development organisation, but wetlands and lagoons do feature pretty highly in your plans. The proposed district plan lists them as areas of significance to Māori. Areas of high natural character, a lot of them, areas of significant natural areas, they're under hazard overlays, and so they trigger a whole bunch of rules in district plans as well as in regional plans, and even national environmental standards are triggered in a lot of cases. So it's a very complex planning framework that we all kind of have to navigate together. Any decisions around the stop banks could affect access to the beach or to some of these environments. Public access, it could affect roading in some places where the road's coming out to the sea and other infrastructure, so there's certainly some district council overlap in terms of what we're trying to do here. I forgot to put on here, and I was asked to put it on, and I still forgot, but the photo in the black and white there is actually 1967, and the one on the colour one's 2022, and it's the same lagoon, so you can see that whole arm of that lagoon parallel to the coast. The land's gone between it and the sea in that, 60-year period or less than 60-year period, and that whole arm of the lagoon is now gone, and the remaining part is being regularly inundated by the sea. So we're in danger of losing this environment sort of in terms of the way it currently functions in the quite near future. And it's quite an important feature. It's the only place known in Canterbury, and I think even maybe the east coast of the South Island, to have giant kokopu, the native fish species, in it. So that would make them locally extinct, or if no action was taken. So they're quite imminent decisions around some of these features. Moving down to Washstrike, the key things here, that again there's a stop bank there. This is the only location really in Canterbury, I think, where the stop bank's actually managed by ECAN. All of the rest of the stop banks are privately owned and privately funded. This one here is part of a drainage rating district, which enables farming of the land between Washstrike and the Opuhi on the coastal strip. And it's a small number of farmers along there. I think there's only half a dozen of them who pay into that rating district and pay for this stop bank that Environment Canterbury manages. So a slightly different situation. And this bank here, again, it's increasingly at risk, but it's slightly less than some of those other ones we showed, but still a decision probably in the next 2 to 5 years will have to be made on that defence. And that in turn affects the drainage scheme that it's protecting and behind, and a whole lot of other things. In terms of the industrial area, it can be flooded in extreme coastal inundation events now, but its overall risk profile isn't too high, but it's an ever-increasing one like everywhere else. And every time, as the lagoon's shrinking, the Washtite Lagoon through erosion, and every time we have to shift stop bank defences or whatever we do, moving landward, the risk profile to the Washtite area basically increases. Here's sort of what I was explaining earlier, a slightly less at-risk bank. You've got a beach crest in the front there, and waves are overtopping that beach crest, and then sort of get dead water in behind the beach, and that's what the stop bank's holding, and that's what they're designed to do. So the stop bank in there is in reasonable condition, but again, in a few years' time, that beach will just migrate into the side of it, and it'll be at that same risk as everywhere else. And this area is what we call the pinch point. It's the narrowest point between the built Washtite development area and the sea, and why it's important is because any sort of freshwater flooding out on the land has to go through that area to get into the lagoon and discharge to sea. There's no other way for it to get to sea, so that little opening there is quite a critical little area at the moment in terms of allowing flooding on the land to get out away without affecting the industrial area. And the last photo is just a railway line south of Timaru. It's just worth always mentioning, but there's several kilometres, about 5 or 6 last time I counted, of railway line where the sea's either basically on it, like in this photo, or sort of within about 20 metres of the actual line. Highly vulnerable. At the moment, the railways are basically trying to defend in place with rock armouring and stuff like that. Here, very ineffectively, but in other places they put it much more robust seawalls. But again, eventually some kind of decision will come where they'll have to either shift landward, spend huge amounts of money protecting, which will only last for so long, or abandon that line altogether, which has implications for what's behind it, because the fact that the railways try and protect their line kind of protects what's in behind it to an extent as well. And if the line wasn't there, then that situation would all change. So just to mention these reports, TDC with ECAN commissioned jointly 2 reports, one on inundation and one on erosion last year. So it's just really to say that they exist and to point out that this information is here and it's what's feeding into your proposed district plan. These maps are of inundation. They show the sort of pink area, the larger area, is a 100-year coastal storm with the current sea level. So you can see some impacts in the Redruth industrial area and Washtite industrial areas, but around that Opahi mouth, quite devastating flooding in terms of the amount of farmland that would go under, the Milford Huts, all of that sort of area, very low lying. And the other colours going forward from there are increased sea level rise scenarios, I guess. Still a 100-year storm, but with more allowance for sea level. There's also an erosion report done, so again, just kind of an awareness that this is here. One thing with erosion, I think it's always worth noting, is that people tend to look at an erosion line on a map and we won't have a problem until erosion reaches there, until it reaches my boundary or my doorstep or something. But with any erosion line, as the sea approaches that line, all the other associated hazards are just going to increase. The risk of inundation, the difficulty in getting rid of freshwater, flooding or stormwater or whatever it may be, the inability to open river mouths, which will be a real factor at Saltwater Creek down there. Currently we open the river mouth in a place where the lagoon's essentially going to be infilled by the sea, the creek mouth I should say, and we open that creek mouth in order to protect the Redruth industrial area from flooding from Saltwater Creek. So that's going to have to change the whole regime of doing that. So there's all these associated factors that as the sea comes back that we have to deal with. It's not just waiting for a line to reach a certain point in time. And I think it's highlighted best at Milford there. You can see the 100-year coastal erosion line, which is the one shown here, is sort of 3/4 of the way through Milford by 2021-20. But really, as soon as that erosion has eliminated or taken the majority of that lagoon out of the front of that community, they're essentially in sort of significant strife. So they'll be seeing problems a long time before the shoreline protection is actually within their community. So just to summarise sort of what we're doing, there's been lots of communications with landowners in the district. They've been approaching ECAN and TDC, DOC, other agencies, political people, lots of communication, community group types things. There's been a lot of on-farm visits and things going forward. The main thing with landowners I've found is they're looking for guidance and ideas. They understand that they'll be funding whatever works may happen. They're not asking for money, generally speaking, but they don't know what to do. They realise it's complicated. They realise the lagoons and wetlands and things make it difficult. They realise that there's a whole lot of interested parties in these environments, and so they're really searching for advice and guidance, and they're just sort of a bit lost on how to proceed. Properties within the district, as we've seen, have been flooded in the last 12 to 18 months. They've started being flooding, and it's not just a one-off thing. Once it happens once, as we saw with those sort of ruined stoppings, that it just leaves you open then to repeated flooding. And some properties are getting flooded of the order of every few weeks to some extent, and it's really a high-stress sort of environment for those people. There's some localised issues around the hut communities, as we talked about, the debris on the beach, South Rangitata and other things. Another issue at Milford Huts, where we have groundwater emergence when the lagoon's higher, which can cause water quality, sort of potential health issues around the huts that we've been dealing with your staff. So there's little issues going on all the time, but then there's this bigger picture of what to do with these communities in the long run. I've said some landowners highly stressful and welfare concerns. That's certainly a factor, and multiple agency visits to all these places. So we've been trying to have sort of wider multi-agency discussions. To give the landowners any guidance, we have to know what Arawhenua think, we have to know what DOC think, we have to talk to TDC. So a lot of what we're doing at a staff level is trying to coordinate these groups, and we have had a couple of sort of multi-agency HUIs, but we've also had a lot of just individual organisations talking to each other regularly, and it has been quite positive. But there's a lot to do in trying to find any kind of decent guidance or solutions here. I think I've said, you can see that bullet point list, I don't read that out or anything, we've said most of those things, but the main one is talking about the planning and consent framework. We're in a kind of changing planning environment here. The regional policy statement and the coastal plan from ECAN are both up for being rewritten in the next few years, and they have significant implications for what happens down here on the coast. Obviously, there's a proposed district plan in the works a long way through, and central government have given some advice in this area, but haven't really given any strong guidance in terms of how coastal adaptation or mitigation will be resourced or funded. And I think the next major sort of indication of when a decision on that might be is the end of 2023. So we're in a kind of flux at the moment where we're awaiting a lot of plans and we're awaiting guidance, but we're actually having issues we have to deal with right now. So a lot of what we're doing now is just trying to make the best of the current situation while we wait on hopefully better planning and better documents we can lean on that say, here's what we're actually trying to achieve along the coast. So we're sort of reliant heavily on just good communication and seeking sort of bespoke solutions, I guess, at a kind of community and just agency level, where and how we can. So issues touch the functions, I've said that, of many different organisations, and there's no single agency that's responsible in this space. I think that's a key factor. It's not really any one organisation's job to kind of work out what to do with these environments and how to manage this retreat of the coast. So again, it just relies on us all kind of working together. And yeah, the focus of discussions, I'll reiterate, has just been seeking kind of joint ambitions for what we want to achieve on the coast, providing advice where we can to landowners on things like consents. But there's no currently any discussion on funding. The agencies all recognise that no one's going to invest until there's more advice from central government, I think. And I think the landowners understand that if they're looking at private defence of their own property, that they will be funding that. They just want to know how they can actually go about doing so. And just before I finish, I'll go really quickly, just a nod to kind of longer term actions. So just so you're aware, there's a Waitaraka Washdyke working group for the catchment in front of the Washdyke industrial area, but also extend, well, that whole catchment that feeds the lagoon. Their intention is to write a strategy, and it's a multi-agency group, sorry, including DOC, RFNO, TDC and ECAN. Our intention is to write a strategy for that catchment, which includes adaptation to the coastal changes, but also all sorts of things like water quality and stormwater issues, whatever it may be. That strategy is intended to be written by the end of the financial year 23-24. So you've got staff involved in that, both at a working group and an overarching kind of steering group level. Some of the communities, particularly at Milford, Hearts, to a lesser extent South Rangitata, increasingly vulnerable. We will have to sooner or later address those communities and how they're going to exist there, or what the future is for those. While these immediate decisions are required, we need some kind of philosophy or planning on what we actually want for the coast, because we really don't want to get in a position where we're sort of encouraging outcomes now, then in 5 years' time, when we do get all this extra planning and sort of central government guidance or whatever it may be, we realise that the decision we made 2 years or 5 years ago or whatever wasn't actually helpful at all to what we want to achieve. So whilst we're trying to deal with immediate issues, we have to keep that longer term philosophy, or develop a longer term philosophy to apply. Otherwise, we're going to sort of get ourselves into really ad hoc and messy situations along the coast. There's a climate change strategy being run for the Timaru district, as you're well known. I think we're speaking later today. So just to note that we've already had a couple of conversations, but we're really keen to sort of, in terms of what the discussions we're having at a multi-agency kind of level about all of these issues, to try to feed that into what they're trying to achieve with the climate change strategy for Timaru district, because there's obviously a lot of overlap there. And just those plan reviews and upcoming LTP rounds will be really important in terms of assisting whatever future outcomes we're looking to find. So I don't think I need to run through the summary. I'll just say, I really do think, like, at the moment, while we exist out of this really clear planning framework, I think if we're going to achieve any results or the best outcomes that we might receive, it's only going to come from good conversations with landowners, talking to each other as agencies, and good communication, I think, is sort of what we're reliant on. We're not asking for any outcome from you in the talk today. It was really just an awareness and sort of thing for you, but it's just, we are talking to your staff frequently on these issues, so I guess just ongoing support of us doing that. And yeah, the future planning, potential consent outcomes, lobbying for external funding, all of those things, I think we'll have a lot more chance of success in those things, I think, if we all can show that we're working together and sort of trying to come up with solutions. And so that's what, I guess, from ECAN's perspective, we're trying to achieve. Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Firth. That was a really good presentation, and I know some of the landowners affected by that, but to see it all, in that presentation and the photos really emphasise the scale of the problem, so I really appreciated that. Thank you. Any questions from the councillors? Councillor Booth.
Always reliable. How many tsunamis have we had in the last 200 years on our coast?
I'll probably leave that one to Helen, who's going to give you a talk on tsunamis very shortly. Yeah. So the mapping I was showing you was inundation from storm events, not tsunamis. Yeah. You will see tsunami mapping shortly.
And the pictures you took, were they after an event, or were they just taken randomly?
The majority of them were after an event earlier this year. Yeah. Generally, we go up after a coastal event. Yeah.
Any other questions? Mayor Bowen?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Firth, do you think, I mean, I agree, I think the multi-agency approach is the only way forward, and, a lot of planning still to be done, but, there's some real at-risk communities, probably Milford's the key one, and that could change overnight, couldn't it? Realistically, what are the? And I guess it's probably a question to both TDC and ECAN. What are some of the tools that we have around, currently around a community like that that's at risk? Because there's a lot of emotion involved, but it doesn't have a. Are we talking to those people? Do they know that it doesn't have a long-term future at this point?
Well, I can say we've spoken regularly to them, sort of in my time at ECAN. So once every few years or so, we've had sort of community days down there. There was one relatively recently, I think maybe last year, we've done jointly with TDC. So we try to inform them of the risk regularly. At the moment, we manage their risk primarily through the flood warning and evacuation type process. And they do have an evacuation plan, which was written with TDC and agreed by the community. So that's what we're reliant on. But I think we're, from a hazards perspective, and it's possibly not the only relevant issue for that community, but from a hazards perspective, what will become difficult is when, we're heading that way, it's harder and harder to give good warning. And that's what I'm talking about, those tidal cycles particularly, like from the river, because they're also prone to river flooding. You generally have some time, but the coast, the dangerous aspect of it is that you can have, like I say, a half full lagoon at 5 in the evening and things are looking okay, but then something changes in the sea conditions. It might only take a slight difference in orientation of the waves, and they start pouring into that lagoon, overnight, and you get a full lagoon in the night time, and then you get, you might have the worst sort of have. So that's where it becomes more and more nervous. Is the difficulty in providing adequate warning is going to just become harder and harder as that lagoon shrinks, and the sea gets closer and closer to it. I think that's a key thing for us. Yeah.
Anything extra?
Through you, Madam Chair. That's like Chris said. We are talking to each other. We do take the opportunity to talk to the community, especially after an event. Justin and I have had conversations about how to do that in a more meaningful way, given that we're moving toward, every time there's an event, it seems to be more frequent and a little more threatening each time. We've got the health issues out there with the water table issues, when we often get sewage or contaminated water coming to the surface when the lagoon's high due to the hydraulics. But we've also got now a more imminent threat from the flooding. And I believe there's a stock bank damage just upwards of the community now, which is adding another threat to that community. So it's not getting any better. But we are talking to them as much as we can.
Sorry, just to follow up, and then where does the risk lie as far as the contamination of groundwater, etc.? Because we know that there's issues.
So the last event that we had where we dealt with contaminated groundwater was from a damaged septic tank that filled with flood water and that forced its contents out onto a neighbouring property, which actually flowed through and underneath the property. And caused a significant amount of contamination. So that building was rendered uninhabitable until it was proven to be cleaned to a habitable standard. So that person was moved to a local motel while that happened, and it was covered by insurance. So I believe ECAN then dealt with the septic tank issue on the offending property, if you like, and that was resolved through working with ECAN and their regulatory function. So we were talking to each other, and we kind of worked together on that one. But it's going to happen more and more out there as it gets worse.
I just have a question, Mr. Cooper, if I may. Is there a plan to remediate that stock bank that's damaged, or is it just informed the community that's there?
Well, we're managing the threat, but that'll be a question for Mr. Firth.
Yeah, it is going to be repaired, and the reason it's taken so long is they've actually been negotiating with the landowner to move it and take a bit more land in order to get a better alignment that they think will work better. So that's been going well, and I think it is all on track to happen, but it has taken a while because there was a landowner sort of negotiation involved. We didn't just put it back exactly where it was previously. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions from councillors? No. Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Firth, for your presentation. That was very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
This report here, just there. Okay, cool. Okay, so just before we move on to 6.2, I'll just ask if someone would like to move that we accept the report on coastal erosion, item 6.1. Thank you, Mayor Nigel, and a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Parker. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Beginners issues. So all in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to item 6.2, which is the tsunami evacuation zone review, and I believe we have Helen Jack, who is going to present this to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everybody. I'm Helen Jack. I'm a senior scientist at Environment Canterbury. I've been there for 15 years, doing all the earthquake and tsunami hazard work with ECAN and the hazards team with Chris. So I've got a geological hazard background. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the tsunami evacuation zone review that's just been done for Timaru District, as well as Ashburton and Waimate districts. And I'll talk a little bit as well about the underlying science, which I have slightly better news for you than Chris did on that one. And if we have time, I mean, I could talk about tsunamis all day, so I don't want to bore you, but if we've got time, there's a few slides just about tsunami warnings as well, because people find that quite useful to understand how official warnings are disseminated and the flow that takes. Just first off, though, I'd like to just say that the review of the tsunami evacuation zones is a really collaborative process between ECAN and the district councils. We provide the science and some of the coordination of the review and a lot of the associated communications that go with it, but the district councils really own the zones. The districts are the ones that have to actually do the evacuations and deal with all the associated welfare issues. So the district councils, or our colleagues at the districts like Phil and at Ashburton and Waimate, they provide the real on-the-ground knowledge when we review these zones and the logistical issues that might be involved as well. So it is a very collaborative approach, but you as a council own these zones. They're not ECAN zones. So moving on. Just a little bit of a 101. So tsunamis are created by the rapid vertical movement of the sea or a lake floor or something falling into the water. So they are a series of fast, long waves. They move very, very fast in the deep water, several hundred kilometres per hour. They slow down in slower water, in shallower water. But they involve the entire water column. So whilst they may not be very high by the time they reach the coast, they are very long waves, so they have a lot of energy behind them. Just one thing to note from that little diagram there, when we talk about wave height at coast, we're talking about that wave amplitude, so it's the height of the crest of the wave above what the normal water level would be at the time. So it's not the trough to crest, it's kind of half of that. So it could be quite tricky, can't it, Phil, trying to work out what a tsunami is going to do. So where the wave height at the coast, and therefore the inundation and the impact of a tsunami, depends on a lot of variables. So it depends on what the source of the tsunami is it an earthquake, a volcano, a landslide? If it's an earthquake, it depends on the size of the earthquake, but also the type of movement. So it's precisely how the fault actually moves. It also then depends on the shape of the sea floor between where the tsunami started and where you are, and also resonance effects that can be set up in your neighbourhood of the coast. We find that places like Pegasus Bay, for instance, when a tsunami comes into Pegasus Bay, it can set up a bit of a sloshing effect in the bay, so that can add to the tsunami height. You guys don't have so much of an issue with that down here, which is good. It then also depends on the topography of the coast and the direction that the waves are coming from, and then also the tide stage and the sea state at the time, which can have quite a significant effect, particularly in South Canterbury. So our job as hazard scientists and emergency managers is to take all those variables and try and package them up into a relatively simple message of, if you're here and this happens, do this, and if you're here and this happens, do that. Or if you're here and this happens, you don't have to do anything. So it is actually quite a complex business trying to fit all that into, or to simplify it down into something that's really easy for people to understand. So just going into the zones straight up. So I'll just talk about these a little bit and then I'll just show you some of the underlying science. I believe that in the paper that you have, there's more detailed maps of these zones in there if you wish to have a look at them. So on the left, we've got the previous tsunami evacuation zones that were drawn up in 2012. That was based on older modelling that we had. And so they were done by Timaru District Council staff, but in conjunction with us. On the right-hand side are the new zones that were released last Monday. So one good thing to note is that they're not outrageously different from each other, which is kind of comforting. So it was good to get some new modelling and know that actually it was a pretty good fit with what we already had. So we've only had to make fairly minor changes to the existing zones. What you will note, a few things to note, I'll explain what the different zones mean. That red zone that runs along closest to the coast and in the sea, that is the zone of the sort of highest hazard. So that is a zone that encompasses beaches, mouth areas. So these are the areas that we would expect to be inundated in a tsunami of sort of any size, even a small tsunami that won't inundate land, but we want people to stay out of the water. That is the zone we want them to stay out of. And then on land, we've got two on-land zones. So these are the zones that we would want people to actually evacuate from, potentially evacuating their houses in a larger tsunami event that we think may flood land. When we do these zones, we follow a national, there's national guidance on this, so it's not just a sort of methodology that we made up ourselves. There is guidance that we are meant to be following, and that says that in sparsely populated areas, we can just have the red zone and then one on-land zone, which is this orange zone in the areas where there's mostly farmland. The orange zone encompasses all tsunamis that we think we might get in a 2,500 year period. So these are extreme events that actually we're not even that likely to see in our own lifetime. But that's the standard that we are required to use when we delineate those zones. So it is worth bearing in mind that these are very big events. Where we have the yellow zones, as you can see there on the right, we've introduced these new yellow zones which give the likes of Phil a little bit more discretion in the sort of areas that may be evacuated during an event. So what it means is that where we think that if we get an official tsunami warning, where the inundation may only be, say, a 1 to 3 metre wave height at coast, we can just evacuate that orange area, and then if it is actually bigger, we can evacuate the yellow if need be, but that's actually very unlikely. So it just means that we're not over-evacuating in every event, say, over 1 metre wave height at coast. It means you're not evacuating people that don't actually need to be evacuated. So in general, we go for the less zones, the better, because it's easier to communicate. But in those more populated areas, we've just divvied it up a little bit finer. What I might just also add there is that the zones are not only based on modelled inundation, but they're based on logistical factors and communication factors. So we often push the boundary a little bit inland, we put a bit of freeboard on it, but also push it inland to, say, roads or other obvious landmarks so that people easily know whether they're in or out of a zone. So I think that's all I had to say about the zones. Anything else to add, Phil?
Yeah, it was life safety only.
Yeah, so one other point about the zones is that they are around life safety, and they are actually, unless there is a state of emergency declared, they are advisory only. So, and there's no restrictions on development or no planning rules in place or anything else around these zones. So they are just for sort of advisory, really, what people should do in an event. So some of the underlying science behind this. So I'll just have a glass of water. The good news for you, unlike some of Chris's news, is that the Timaru coast in general has a lower tsunami hazard than most other areas in Canterbury and most other areas in New Zealand. And this is because it doesn't have any large, significant tsunami sources just offshore, unlike other parts of New Zealand, and also because just the shape of the Canterbury Bight tends not to amplify tsunami waves once they get in here. So what you're looking at here is wave heights at coast for a 2,500 year return period, so once again extreme events, and this is from the most recent iteration of the National Tsunami Hazard Model. So you're looking there at sort of 4 to 6 metre wave height at coast tsunamis for that return period. If you go down to sort of a 500 year, you're looking at 2 to 4 metres wave height at coast along this stretch of coast. So to compare that to some of the stuff Chris was showing you, that equates that sort of inundation equates to about 100 or more like 100-year coastal storm inundation. So you're getting the same kind of inundation from a 100-year coastal storm as you might do for a several 100-year tsunami, just because your tsunami hazard is lower and your coastal storm hazard is a little bit higher. You can see there as well, just in Pegasus Bay, that resonance effect where the wave heights are higher there, and that's also not because they've got particular significant sources just offshore. It is just that effect of it. Pretty much anything coming in from the east, Pegasus Bay will amplify, so that's just one thing to note up there as well. And so where do these tsunamis come from then that you may get here? So we divvy up tsunamis based on how far away they are coming from. So a local source tsunami is defined as 1 hour's travel time from Timaru. There's actually no known tsunami sources within 1 hour's travel time of Timaru. There's been a bit of work done out in the Canterbury Bight doing seismic reflection work, and they have not discovered any significant tsunami sources. So that is good news. There's always the possibility that there could be an underwater landslide, say, triggered by a large earthquake. or there could be a fault that we didn't know about. As we all know, that has happened before. And so we still want to be cautious, but there's nothing that we know of. Your closest fault source that we know of is the Akator fault, just south of Dunedin, which is just over an hour's travel time away, if that was to make a tsunami. Regional sources are defined as 1 to 3 hours travel time away, and you can see there to the south of Fiordland there's the Pusaga subduction zone, so that is quite a significant source. We're looking at around about 2 to 3 hours travel time to Timaru from that source, and then the Hikurangi subduction zone off the east coast of the North Island there, and going up into the Kermadec subduction zone, which is further to the north. The southern Hikurangi subduction zone, we're looking at about 2 hours travel time to Timaru as well. So those are very significant tsunami sources. If those do create a tsunami, they will be affecting a large area of New Zealand, not just Timaru. And then anything that's further than 3 hours travel time away we call distant source, and for the east coast of New Zealand, particularly the South Island, the most significant distant sources are South America and Central America, but all the significant tsunamis that we've had in Canterbury have come from South America, except for the Kaikoura earthquake. There's also sources up to the North and East Pacific, but they would produce much smaller tsunamis here. So, in answer to how many tsunamis have we had before in Timaru, here is a list of tsunamis that have been observed or recorded in Timaru. You'll notice that most of them are since 2004, and that's simply because we've got better ways of recording them now. Most of those you probably wouldn't even notice on the beach, but they are picked up on tsunami, either tsunami gauges or the port tide gauge. The most significant ones of these have been the 1868 Peru, 1877 Chile, in the 1960 Chile, in 2010 Chile. 1960 Chile, in one of the aftershocks to that, there was an evacuation warning put out, and everyone apparently took off from the factory at Pariora and went off to the St Andrews pub for the afternoon. That's probably quite a good place to go, actually. It's out of the Waimate evacuation zones, I might add, so it's all good. 2010 Chile tsunami, there's a photo of that there where you can see there's it didn't inundate land, but it did go up beyond the high tide mark on Caroline Bay, and it created some really strong currents in the bay there. There's still quite a few people on the beach having a bit of a stroll around. That's probably not great. It's not really what we want to see. But it's just a reminder that even in a small tsunami that doesn't inundate land, you still need to be aware that these things are coming. And then just out of interest, here's 2016 Kaikoura tsunami picked up on the port tide gauge. The tsunami arrived about just over 2 hours after the earthquake. The maximum crest to trough was about 0.75 metres. So it wasn't enormous, but it was still notable in the port. And as you can see, the waves do continue for quite some time, a number of hours after that event. So you do get them, just most of them aren't big. However, sometimes we might get big ones and we need to know what to do. So I will just quickly go through just some of the modelling results that we had. So what we did is we asked GNS Science to model a lot of different tsunami scenarios for us. This is part of a wider lot of modelling that we're getting them to do for the Canterbury coast. So we said, can you model a bunch of 3 metre wave height at coast tsunamis? So these are tsunamis that would generate a 3 metre wave height at the Timaru coast. And so these are generated from earthquakes in Central and South America and in the sort of New Zealand region. These are all really big earthquakes. These are magnitude 8.7 plus earthquakes. That's how much it takes to get a 3 metre wave height at the Timaru coast. We also asked them to do a bunch of 5 metre wave height at coast tsunamis, and then we also said, okay, just give us some worst cases. So something that we would expect, like more than once every 200 or 2,500 years. So our worst cases in Timaru is a magnitude 9.45 in South America, and then a magnitude sort of 9 pluses on the southern Kermadec, Hikurangi and Pusica subduction zones. So those are our biggest threats for South Canterbury. So I've got just some results here to show just quickly. Interestingly, the 3 metre wave height at coast results, they assume that the largest wave arrives at high tide. So we've pretty much added 1.2 metres on to the sort of base model, and that's how they run the model. It does assume a flat sea, and as we are aware, that's not always the case in South Canterbury. But what the 3 metre modelling does show is that there is very little inundation along most of the mid and South Canterbury coast, and that is mainly due to the fact that there's steep beaches or coastal cliffs, and the fact that you've got the coastal stop banks there. However, as Chris has shown, the condition of those in some places is not great, and so when we consider these model results, we do take them with a little bit of caution. And then we've got 5 metre wave height at coast results as well, and that shows a little bit more inundation in those river mouth areas and the really low-lying areas. And then also the low-lying areas around Timaru, the lagoon, particularly Caroline Bay, and some parts of the industrial area and around South Beach and Saltwater Creek. And so again, these are the sort of size waves we would expect from a tsunami every several hundred years. They're unusual, but that's what we need to consider. I have one animation for you. I shall start it off now because it takes a couple of minutes. This is the Hikurangi subduction zone, a tsunami generated by a magnitude 8.9 event on that subduction zone. This is from our friends at GNS Science. And the red there is 2 metres elevation sea level up, and the blue is 2 metres down. And what you can actually see at the start of this is actually the entire sea being pushed up or coming down from just the effect of the earthquake itself, because the earthquake will push up the sea, and that is what's generating the tsunami. You've got a whole lot of water being pushed up, and then it's got to go somewhere, so it flows out either side. At the the right-hand side there, you can see the tsunami itself starting to propagate away. This is after 5 minutes, and then it speeds up here, and the tsunami itself starts to propagate down towards the South Island. It travels very quickly in the deeper water of the Hikurangi Trough, but once it reaches that shallower water around Pegasus Bay and then into South Canterbury, it slows down quite considerably. But what I want you to notice is how that wave, that white sort of wave front there, bends right around Banks Peninsula. And so it has the effect of the wave almost coming in sort of straight on to the entire South Canterbury coast. And I guess one thing to note is that you sort of think, oh, well, the Banks Peninsula will shield us from this scenario, but in fact it doesn't. And in parts of the mid-Canterbury coast, around Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora, it actually kind of swings right around and focuses those waves in. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. And unfortunately, this animation stops just before it gets to South Canterbury, but we are getting them to make some more pretty animations for us that we can use for community meetings, including one of the Pusica subduction zone as well, because it's just interesting to see the way that the wave actually moves. How are we going for time, Phil? I don't want to... Doing all right? Good-o. So I just want to show you just some of the worst case scenarios, and these are what we have based the inland extent of the evacuation zones on. So probably the two worst case scenarios for Timaru are the Hikurangi subduction zone and the Pusaka subduction zone. This map here shows the inundation from that, and most of it is on that coastal area between the Rangitata River and Washdyke, and then again Caroline Bay, Redruth, and parts of South Beach, parts of Periora as well. Down the bottom here you can see this is the modelled tide gauge at Timaru Port. So this just shows that it gives you an idea of how long you've got before the wave arrives. So it's about 2 hours before the wave arrives in Timaru, but you can see that there's still significant waves arriving after 4 hours, 6 hours. So they keep coming like for a very long time. What we did ask GNS to do is to model a lot of different scenarios for the southern Hikurangi, because you can have the same size earthquake in the same location producing quite different tsunamis, and solely based on just that way that the fault slips. So if a lot of the movement on the fault is deeper down, you might not get as large a tsunami, even though it's the same size earthquake. And this just makes it a little bit tricky to predict what will happen. So you can't sort of say, oh, well, if we've got a magnitude 9 on the Hikurangi, it's going to do this, because it is so dependent on the way that the fault slips. And we won't know that in advance. And just so to illustrate that, just bear with me, the wiggly worms up in the top right, that's is a map of the South Canterbury coast. Banks Peninsula is up in the top and Otago Peninsula down in the bottom. And it's got these three different coastlines there. The top shows what they've modelled 30 different scenarios. So the top shows you what the worst of that would be, so the worst wave height, and so you're getting up into 6-7 metres wave height at coast. The bottom shows you what the minimum wave height would be from the sort of best case scenario, and it's in the order of 2 to 3 metres. So if we get a large earthquake on the southern Hikurangi, it could be 3 metres wave height at coast here, it could be 7 metres, and we're not going to know. So it's just to illustrate that, there is a lot of uncertainty. When we do the evacuation zones, of course, we take the worst case, and that's what it's based on, but it could be a lot less than that. Just quickly, we've got results for the Pusaka scenario, which is quite similar to the Hikurangi, and just showing you there the tide gauge at the port as well. So that's arriving 3 hours after the earthquake, but there's still significant waves arriving at 6 hours, 8 hours. And then there's also a worst case Kermadec scenario, which doesn't flood quite as much land. That's arriving just after 3 hours as well after the earthquake. And just the last worst case is the Peru coming from South America. That doesn't inundate quite as much land either. You can see that it arrives about 16 hours after the earthquake. But just one thing to note with this as well is that if you look at those wiggly worms up in the top right, there is much less variation between the worst and the minimum we might expect from that, because the influence of the way that the fault slips is not as great for distant source tsunamis, because all sorts of other factors, including the way that it travels across the Pacific Ocean, play a much larger part in the size of that tsunami. So it means we've got a lot more certainty about tsunamis that are coming from South America than we do about what's coming from our own backyard. And we've also got a lot more time up our sleeve as well to do something about this one. So I've just got 3 more slides about tsunami warnings. Do you want to hear about those as well? Yep. I think it's important just to note how tsunami warnings work, because there's a lot of variation in what happens as well. So just firstly, the natural warnings are the most important. If you feel a long or a strong earthquake, and a long earthquake is more than a minute, and a strong earthquake is it's hard to stand up, you evacuate the red and the orange zones. As I've said, we don't know of any very local sources, but we just can't rule anything out, and we want people to move if they have those natural warnings. If we've got more time, you will get an official warning, and that is disseminated through many different channels. The official warnings work that the Pacific Tsunami Warning Centre is located in Hawaii there in the middle of the Pacific. That monitors the Pacific Ocean for all earthquakes over 6.5. It'll send out an advisory for anything larger than 6.5. And so initial warnings go out based solely on the size of the earthquake. But as we know, that's only one factor in how big a tsunami might be. So this here shows where the tsunami buoys are currently located in the Pacific Ocean. And so until a tsunami actually reaches one of those buoys, we don't know for sure that a tsunami has been generated or what size it is. We're getting more and more of those buoys, and all those green ones there in the neighbourhood of New Zealand have recently been deployed by us at the cost of, what was it, Phil, about $11 million just in the last couple of years. Before that, we didn't have anything in the South Pacific, so we were kind of flying blind when it came to something happening on the Kermadec or the Hikurangi subduction zone. Those purple ones that are off the Fiordland coast are actually owned by the Australians to warn them of something coming from the Fusaga subduction zone. Luckily, everyone shares all their data, so we can use those ones for us as well. So when something comes in from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Centre or from GeoNet, because now we've got 24/7 monitoring of our region by GeoNet, so they can send out things very quickly. However, and this is just the last slide that shows the sort of products we get from the National Emergency Management Agency through GeoNet. So that first map on the left is sent out, that can be sent out for local sources, local to New Zealand, so that includes those big subduction zones, and they can be sent out within 15 to 30 minutes. However, for some parts of the North Island, the tsunami already would have reached the North Island. So that's why you've still got to just do the natural warnings. Do not wait for an official warning. And effectively, that map says, and these are all like pre-modelled maps, so that if there is a magnitude 9 on the Hikurangi, they can pull out a map immediately and go, right, that one, send that one out. Everyone in the black area, you should be evacuating. Everyone in the hatched area, you should evacuate if you've felt a long or strong earthquake, but we're still assessing. So it effectively tells people if you have felt a long or strong earthquake, you should evacuate, which they should be doing anyway, but often we do find people do wait, and so this tells them to do it. So for the Timaru area, and this does include, say in this example, the black area is included in Timaru, so we would say orange and red zones evacuate in that instance. When we've got a little bit more time, for something coming from further away, we get a forecast map, which can give us much more detailed information on the sort of wave height that we would expect in those areas. And this is an example from, I think this is a sort of New Caledonia, north of New Caledonia example. So what we've got here is for the Timaru coast, we can expect a 0.3 to 1 metre wave. And in that case, we would only be evacuating the red zone. So, and if we had, if the Timaru there was say the blue, we would be looking at a 1 to 3 metre wave height at coast. We would evacuate, well, Phil, I should say, would evacuate the orange and red zones. And then if it was a 3 to 5 metre wave height at coast for the Timaru area, which is that blue, we would also be evacuating those yellow zones as well. So what this forecast map does is it ties in to the evacuation zone levels so that you don't actually have to sit there in an emergency and go, oh, what should we be evacuating with this threat level? They're keyed into each other so that if it's 3 to 5 metres, right, it's all the zones. If it's only 1 to 3, it's red and yellow. Red and orange. So it makes it more of a streamlined process. So, and just the last thing I would add is that during an event, often the first reported magnitude of an earthquake that we get through often underestimates the actual size of the earthquake, and as more information comes in, that magnitude is often revised upwards, sometimes down, but often up. So don't be surprised if we get a warning through, it says it's this size, so we need to do this, and then half an hour later it's been revised up, we need to do this. Things do change a lot during those sort of warnings, and that might just explain why sometimes it looks a little bit messy, but we're always acting on the best information that we've got.
Thank you very much. It was really good to understand the sources of tsunamis and the risk to our district. It was a bit remiss of me not to allow Mr. Cooper to introduce that paper. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think it's been covered off quite well, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So I'll open up the questions from councillors. Councillor Parker.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. Alpine fault, AFA, what is the likelihood of that impacting on a tsunami?
Very good question, and thank you for asking. The Alpine fault is very unlikely to generate a tsunami in and of itself from the fault movement. It may generate offshore landslides on the west coast that could generate localised tsunamis on the west coast. So we're not expecting a tsunami that would affect the east coast from the Alpine fault earthquake. However, you will feel it here as a long and probably a strong earthquake, and you won't know where that's coming from immediately. So we would still expect that a lot of the east coast of the South Island will evacuate in that event. And so one of our priorities during that response is to actually, once we've determined that it is the Alpine fault, is to tell people that they don't need to evacuate and that they can go home. And we do expect that to be a bit of an issue, actually, that people will be evacuating, but they don't actually need to. But they should in the first instance.
Thank you. Councillor Scott.
I just have a question around the revised tsunami evacuation zones. Now it's updated. Do direct communications go out to all people that live or work within those yellow, red, orange zones?
Through the chair, initially, no, we're not going to do an initial letter drop just because of the commercial area's uncertainty of the address points. But however, we are engaging through media and any community engagement, and we hope that we will incite a lot of community engagement, and we will go and speak to any group, and we'll do some outreach to some commercial businesses, especially in the Washdyke area, just due to the complexities of evacuation due to roading.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Shannon.
Wrong one. Thanks, Jackie. It's actually a question for Group Manager Cooper. So these zones, they will appear within our district plans so when people look at their own properties?
No, these are unrelated to the district plan review. So the coastal inundation mapping and natural hazards is in the district plan, in the proposed district plan. But these tsunami zones are advisory, so they don't feature. Yeah.
Can I just add to that? Sorry, jumping in. There is some national guidance It's been a bit of an issue before this because we haven't had really robust enough modelling to base land use planning on. For the Timaru Coast though, it's very likely that the inundation from the sort of size tsunami you would be considering for land use planning, which is about a 500-year-ish sort of return period, is covered in the other coastal hazards, and that those provisions mitigate the tsunami risk as well. So our advice is generally that you don't need to have separate tsunami hazard provisions in the district plan at this point.
Thank you, Mayor Bowen.
Sorry, a question for you, Phil. In regard to our evacuation plans for Periora, Milford Huts, those sorts of things, I was speaking to a guy, a resident of Periora, and hearing aids, really hard of hearing, wouldn't pick up on the sirens, said he'd struggle with the alert systems. Do we, within those communities, sort of have those conversations around those at-risk individuals? And hearing isn't someone you would normally put at risk, still mobile, but just wouldn't pick up on alert. Is that something we consider with those, probably more so, you know, those at-risk communities as opposed to urban Timaru?
Through the chair, it's a great question, and I think that we could almost do that for any hazard, as we have got vulnerable people that we don't know about. My initial advice would be it's up to them to talk to their neighbours. You know, whenever we send out EMA, so emergency mobile alert, which will be one of the IAs that we do for a tsunami threat, is check on your neighbours, make sure your neighbours know of this threat. We also sound the sirens, so when the new sirens do get installed, or siren gets installed in Periora, that would be another trigger. So yeah, because depending on the timeline, one of the challenges will be, will we actually put response agencies in there to do evacuations? Because the timeline may be too short, so it may be just, you need to self-evacuate, you need to be self-aware. And I think one of the local messaging and also the national messaging around tsunami evacuation zones is own your zone. We really need to put tsunami warnings and tsunami advice back onto the landowner, that person, so they know what to do. Just like if I go to Christchurch City, if I go to holiday in Napier, I need to know what to do if I feel a long or strong earthquake. So, but I take the point, Mayor Bowen, that we do need to consider all those vulnerable communities.
Any other questions? If not, I'd like to thank you for your report and ask if someone would recommend that that the Environmental Services Committee receive and a seconder. Thank you, Mayor Bowen. All in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, so we'll move on to item 6.3, which is the climate change strategy. And I believe we have Mr. Dixon to introduce this, along with Dr. Driver and Mr. Taylor, and I'm sorry, one other person. Oh, of course, Rosie, sorry, I have met you before. Too many faces. Thank you. So I'll leave it to you, Mr. Dixon.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So what the purpose of this report is really to provide an update on the work that is going on at the moment in developing a climate change strategy. It is evolving, and we're working with the community on this, and we're getting some really good buy-in and feedback from the work that's been done here. Yeah, it's climate change strategy sort of ties everything together. We've already heard about some of the impacts of climate change in regard to the coastal erosion, the inundation, and there is a need for council to have a strategy and to tie in with some of these other pieces of work that's going on. So I'd like to introduce here Phil Driver, who is a consultant who is sort of leading, I guess, this strategy, and he'll just give a quick update on the work that's been done to date. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. The key point with the Timaru District Climate Change Strategy is this is a strategy for the district, not just for the council. because a lot of the actions on climate change will happen out in the community, and certainly the various agencies, TDC, ECAN and others will be involved, but a lot will happen in the community. So we're driving a climate change strategy for the district as a whole. Just a little bit of background. The International Panel on Climate Change made the statement that it is unequivocal that humans are causing climate change, and by unequivocal they mean greater than 99.9% certain. Scientists don't use the word unequivocal very often, so for them to say it is that certain, it is that certain. So we're operating on that basis. These are the stages we're going through. I'll just go through this slide quickly. We're developing a strategy for the district, not just the council. So the first thing is, governance statements, which I'll show you in a minute. We then expanded community knowledge around climate change with a big public meeting on the 21st of September. And I'm delighted at the number of people who are engaging in this project. We've had several hundred people so far, plus a lot of staff at Timaru District Council and ECAN, and in particular Reece Taylor, your new climate change advisor. We've established an advisory group that we are endeavouring to make as representative of our communities as possible. So we're up to about 12 or 15 people on that, serving voluntarily. We're distilling community perspectives from various workshops. And what will come out of the end of this is what I call a high-level strategy. So that will be establishing the values and principles. And nested under that will be a set of sub-strategies on specific topics. So I'll just cover those very quickly. The governance statements, Council has signed up to 3 statements. The first one is to be a climate-friendly council, and essentially that means you'll do climate-friendly stuff in-house, sort out your own act. Second one, you'll lead and facilitate mitigation and adaptation projects with others, with our communities, with our businesses, with our farmers, with our communities, and in collaboration with our Te Reti partners. And finally, there will be a focus on helping people to learn and adapt, particularly vulnerable people. And people can be vulnerable in 3 ways. They can be exposed to climate change, but not impacted very much. They can be impacted by it, and they can be not very resilient. In other words, people who have already got all sorts of problems on their plate. So that's what the council signed up to. I'm just going to run through quickly the speakers at the event we had, and it's not for reading all of these, it's simply to show the range and quality of speakers who are happy to come and talk to us. Every single one I asked to speak did speak, so we've got internationally recognised professors associated with the International Panel on Climate Change, and we had a whole lot of local people, Director of General Manager of Temuka Transport, CEO of Venture Timaru, Regional Manager Fulton Hogan, and so on. So there's a lot of people in our community taking this issue of climate change very, very seriously. The photo on the left just shows the people at our first event. The chart on the right is just an example of the communications model we're using. We're using the term action on climate change in all our releases, and that just, obviously don't need to read it, but just showing the format we're using. This is a format for the workshops down at the new Eco Centre. If you haven't been there, I thoroughly recommend you go. It's a fabulous centre for workshops. You'll see on the wall, there's a whole lot of white panels. They have huge amounts of data that we're collecting from the community, and at this stage, we've got about 18 pages of contributions from our communities, contributions to the climate change strategy. We're now getting into the detail of the strategies, and the first one that seems to be pretty high priority for a number of people is this issue of coastal inundation and erosion. So we heard this morning what the various agencies are doing. So we can have an agency looking at a stop bank or looking at flooding. We need to understand what the individuals want to do. Do they want to live with it? Do they want to put their house on stilts? Do they want to pay higher rates and put a bigger stop bank around it? Or do they want to retreat? And if so, where are they going to want to retreat to? So the human side of coastal inundation and erosion is something we're going to tap into while working with the agencies at the same time. It's actually a very challenging topic. Some of the other topics that are coming through as priorities for our communities relate to the resilience of water supplies, and that can be individual wells through to Timaru District Council water supply. People wanting low greenhouse gas emission transport, extreme weather events are of concern. I don't know how many of you are aware of the extreme weather event we had this last autumn. We probably didn't notice it. It was a very long period of several months of warm, humid weather attributed to the La Nina weather pattern, and it caused the harvest from hell for our arable farmers, and it cost millions, a single event triggered by climate change. We've got $1.6 billion worth of agricultural production in the Timaru district. If we have an extreme weather event that knocks that back by 10%, that's $160 million in a single event. Farmers are going to be the worst affected by climate change, and the numbers are very, very big. We've had a lot of people looking at community-based and private food growing. Venture Timaru is working with companies at Washdyke looking at the use of bulk biological wastes. Can they recombine them into valuable products? And there will be other topics emerging as this project goes on. So that's my presentation. Any questions?
Thank you very much. Any questions from councillors? No, you got off lightly. Thank you very much, Dr. Driver. There's no further questions. I'd just like to ask if someone would move that the Environmental Services Committee receives and note the Climate Change Strategy Progress Report. Thank you, Councillor Oliver, and a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Burt. All in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you very much. And if there's no further business, I believe that brings the meeting to a close. Thank you. Apologies.